Whoever you are, we welcome you. Wherever you come from, we welcome you. Whoever you love, we welcome you. Whoever you love, we welcome you.
I spent a good part of my childhood in a kind of paradise. We lived with my grandparents in the little town of La Habra, California, in Orange County, during the time that my father, an Air Force officer, was away during the Vietnam War. So it was a paradise for me, but I have to also acknowledge that it was built on a great deal of pain. The suffering, the great suffering of the Vietnamese people, and the loss of many lives in the Vietnam War, my mother's sadness at having to be away from her husband, and many other difficult factors. But being a young child, I didn't know any of that. All I knew was that my grandfather and I would walk down the steps every morning into their beautiful yard and pick oranges and avocados and peaches and plums and eat them and laugh and play in the sunshine. It was paradise, an embodied experience of a beautiful garden, deep connections with the people around me, abundant food, the sounds of animals, and a healthy ecosystem surrounding me. And when I think back to that time, it's funny, kind of odd, but the sound of the mourning doves is what always brings it back to me. So anytime that I hear a mourning dove, as I heard one this morning actually, as I was getting ready to come here, in that sad, mournful sound, I find paradise, and it's with me again. Now, growing up, I was 2 generations removed from anyone who believed in the Christian theology and believed in the stories in the Bible. So I did not grow up being a churched person, despite my last name, and I did not have any familiarity with the Easter story. All I knew of Easter was that I found my basket on Easter morning, and it was the Easter bunny who brought me chocolate and candy. And later I came to understand Easter from the TV movies that I would often watch late at night that came on around this time of spring. The robe and some of the other religiously oriented stories. That's where I really picked up my understanding of the holiday of Easter and the resurrection and what Christianity was all about. So from these movies, I developed a vague sense of guilt that someone had died for me and all the other sinful people in the world. And I didn't really understand what that was all about. But I had this vague understanding that it was something very sad and very difficult, and that I was somehow at fault. Now, later we moved away from California and we went to places that had a lot of snow, and like Alaska, where I lived for many, many years. And during that time in my life, I came to understand in such a visceral way that I hadn't understood when I lived in California, the appeal of the pagan Easter story, right? The coming back to life of the earth when spring comes around again. Everything seeming to be dead, and then lo and behold, the earth awakes again. That was almost our religion when we lived in Alaska. An amazing resurgence of life each spring. And here in Erie, we can probably relate to that too. Now, these natural cycles and this pagan history of this holiday of Easter, I spent most of my life saying this was the origin of the Easter holiday. So this other story, this Jesus story, was mapped onto it later. Why should I really need to understand it? But this year I decided I really want to dig into an understanding of what this was all about. I want to do some reading and do some research and really start to understand the story of the resurrection in a way that makes sense for me. And so whether I decide to be a Christian or not, I want to have a literacy with this story and have an understanding of the ways that people have thought about it for 2,000 years, including some of our spiritual ancestors as Unitarians and Universalists. So that was sort of my motivation and my starting place for this journey that I went on with Easter. Now, I chose for my great text a book called Saving Paradise by two theologians, Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Parker, who both identify as Unitarian Universalist. The way that their book unfolded is that they were studying early Christianity, and they went on a journey across the Middle East and to other places that had early Christian churches to study the art of the early Christian churches. And they were absolutely stupefied when they got to where they were going, and there were no images of crosses anywhere. There were no images of Jesus dying. Everything that they saw in these early churches was an image of Jesus in a pasture, a beautiful pasture, green, with rivers flowing around it, and deer nearby, fountains, and abundant life everywhere. And so what they realized from this is that the story of substitutionary atonement, meaning the idea that Jesus died for a sinful humanity, came much, much later in the Christian history. And that at the beginning of this religion that we call Christianity, Jesus was much more of a folk hero. And he was known as the man who beat death. He was known as the man who escaped death. And there were even images of like a burly Jesus with some blocks of wood attached to his wrists, kind of going like this and celebrating the fact that he had overcome death. And he offered a portal as well for all of us to get back to the paradise that was located somewhere on the earth. We couldn't exactly figure out where. That we had been shut out of, supposedly, the Garden of Eden. So by resisting the powers that be, the powers of Rome at the time, Jesus overcame death and then offered a portal to those who would follow him. And that portal was the church. The church was known as a place where people had no status, there were no rich, there were no poor. There were only people coming together to create a joyful community. And the hallmark of this, the rituals of the church was the community dinner, where all shared what they had together, and where they recreated paradise on this earth. Jesus was seen as a second Adam. Jesus undid the things that had happened during the history in the Garden of Eden, undid the curse that locked humanity out of the garden, and he opened the gates to all. So the church, as an expression of that regained paradise, was a place where everywhere you looked, there was a beautiful meadow, a beautiful pasture, animals leaping about, happy people embracing. And that sounds very, very familiar to me. It sounds like the way that we feel when we think about spring, right? It feels like a celebration. Now, I had always thought that you could either choose the Easter story or you could choose the pagan story, but you had to make a choice. But what I understood from reading this exhaustive research, this very, very careful research about early Christianity, is that there's really no conflict between those two things. That the early church was about joy, that the emphasis was on Jesus' life, Jesus' teachings, and Jesus' ability to offer paradise to his followers through God. So there was a threefold world in the conception of the early Christians. There was this place where we live, this place, the ordinary earth. And then somewhere else on earth, there was this beautiful paradise where you went when you died. So rather than this removed idea of heaven somewhere out there, actually the dead were thought to be on the earth in a beautiful garden where they waited to see their loved ones when their loved ones passed on. So there was this idea of paradise as well, an earthly realm still, but a realm of the dead. And then the third tier of this conception of the universe was, of course, God in the heavens, directing the beauty of the stars and the planets and the spheres. And so I think we'll stop there because we have another beautiful offering from our choir today, and we're all so glad to have the choir back with us. So choir, why don't you come on up here? So what would it mean for us if paradise were actually on this earth? Well, for one thing, it might mean that this world is a good world, not a sinful and fallen one. That this place that we find ourselves in, this earth, is not just a way station. It's not just some place that we have to wait it out on our way to someplace better. It would mean that we truly belong to this earth, and this earth to us. This is our permanent home. And caring for this home, this beautiful garden that we have here, would be all of our work to do, wouldn't it? And as Rita Nakashima Brock and Rebecca Parker say, our work would be to hold fast to the core goodness of this world, to truly believe in it, to bring it about. It would mean that joyful living is our birthright, and that life, not death, is the meaning of the Easter story. That the divine presence in our lives, however we may experience it, is not a cruel, transactional, judging figure, just waiting for us to make any mistakes and then exacting penance, but a loving presence who suffers with us, rejoices with us, hopes and dreams with us, and wants what is most life-giving for us. Now, it would also mean that we are called to action, to right living, to sharing what we have with those who have very little, being in relationship with all of humanity and all of life. And it would mean that the story of the resurrection, just like the story of spring here in the northern regions, means that all is not lost when death appears. That our universe is always generating more life, new and surprising stories, and great mysteries, if only we can remain open to them. It means when I hear a mourning dove, that even though I acknowledge the sadness and the sound and the sadness of much of life, that I can also rejoice that I had that beautiful experience of paradise, and that that experience is available to me at any moment that I hear that sound. That for a second I'm back with my grandfather and my grandmother in that beautiful paradise that we shared. Now, for far too long, we have been separated from one another by stories of suffering, stories of inadequacy, stories of never being good enough. And we've suffered alone and afraid in worlds of sadness. Let this Easter moment be a moment when we come back to paradise, to the knowledge that together we can sustain through any winter, any hardship, and any cruel season of death. Let the stone be rolled away as our hearts rediscover the joy of connection, as we come alive, awake, and aware together once again. As the earth awakens here in northwestern Pennsylvania, as we know it will, let us rejoice. Welcome home. Welcome home to life. Welcome home to the earth. Welcome home to this day in paradise.